Commencing in 1959, a few months after the Avro era was cancelled, Canadair began building Canada's next fighter aircraft at their Montreal plant. It was designed as a sleek, high-altitude, high-speed interceptor, but was adapted for low-level nuclear strike and photo reconnaissance missions. It was the Canadair CF-104 Starfighter, still the fastest aircraft ever flown in Canada. During the 1950s, Canada's NATO commitment was to the air defense of Europe. At the end of World War II, Canada had the fourth largest air force in the world, but by the CF-104 era, it had been reduced to 50,000 members. The RCAF deployed 12 squadrons of day fighters across 4 bases in Europe, 2 in France at Marville and Grotonquin, and 2 in West Germany at Zweibrücken and Baden-Solingen. Initially, these squadrons consisted of Canadian-built F-86 Sabres, but later included CF-100 Canucks to provide an all-weather capability. The RCAF's No. 1 Air Division squadrons were considered to be some of the best formations that NATO fielded in Europe at the time. In the 1950s, Canada revised its role to the defense of a changing threat. Initially, Canada's role was the protection of Europe from waves of nuclear-armed Soviet bombers. However, the launch of Sputnik shifted the threat to that posed by similarly armed ballistic missiles. The ballistic missiles could not be intercepted, so militaries worldwide pivoted their focus and their budgets away from interceptor aircraft. One unfortunate result for Canada was the cancellation of the Avro Aero Interceptor and Arenda Iroquois engine. NATO requested that Canadian squadrons switch from an all-weather fighter intercept role to tactical nuclear strike and reconnaissance roles. RCAF planners welcomed this shift, as the now seemingly obsolete Sabre fighters were due to be retired, but it would prove to be a politically controversial move. The new tactical role tender led to a profusion of new aircraft type submissions. Among those considered by the RCAF were the English Blackburn Buccaneer, the French Dassault Mirage 3C, the Italian Fiat G91, the American Grumman Super Tiger, the Lockheed F-104G Starfighter, the Northrop N-156, and the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, equipped with an Avro Canada Arenda Iroquois engine. The Thunderchief Iroquois combination was the initial favorite, as it would revive Arenda's premier project, but the rapidly spiraling costs and a requirement for local construction led to the selection of the Lockheed F-104G Starfighter. Initially designed in the 1950s as a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor, Lockheed was convinced that the F-104 could operate as a multi-mission low-level attack aircraft. It was marketed to Germany and other NATO nations as a replacement for older obsolete types. Lockheed had developed the F-104G, which significantly improved on the original 104 design. It incorporated a strengthened airframe, larger vertical fin, a new technology inertial navigation system, uprated engine, improved flight controls, and an improved fire control radar with ground mapping capability. RCAF officials felt that the Swift Interceptor's performance could be well adapted to the low-level strike and reconnaissance roles. Unlike the USAF and other air forces such as Japan and Italy, the RCAF had no intention of using the 104 as an interceptor. Instead, it would be used in the strike role as a nuclear bomber and as a high-speed, low-level photo reconnaissance platform. In August of 1959, a procurement contract was signed with Lockheed, and Canadair was chosen to modify and produce the design according to Canadian specifications. Canadair's internal designation for the Starfighter was the CL-90, and the RCAF's was the CF-111. But the RCAF would change their designation to fall in line with the Americans, and it became the CF-104. The F-104G variant was used as the basis for Canadair's production run. Modifications would significantly improve the aircraft in order to meet the requirements of the RCAF and optimize it for the nuclear strike and reconnaissance role. Changes included a dedicated air-to-ground R-24A NASAR radar set, the replacement of the 20mm M61A1 cannon and shell storage area with range-extending fuel tanks, provisions for a centerline mounted reconnaissance pod equipped with 4 Vinton Vicon 70mm cameras, longer stroke liquid springs for the undercarriage, and larger tires. The USAF provided an F-104C pattern aircraft for Canadair, and it was serialized as 104-700. Construction of the Canadian variant started in 1959 at Canadair's plant in Cartierville, Quebec. The first CF-104 was shipped to Palmdale, California, and its first flight was on the 26th of May 1961. The third and fourth Starfighters, number 12703 and 12704, took their first flights from Montreal on August 14, 1961. On behalf of Lockheed, Canadair went on to build 200 CF-104s and a further 140 F-104G wing sections and rear airframes for Germany. Under license, Orenda Engines was contracted to build the General Electric J79, designated as a J79 OEL-7 variant, to power them. Construction would continue until the last Starfighter, serial number 12900, was rolled out on September 4, 1963. Final deliveries of the aircraft were completed by January 1964. To complete the procurement, a further 38 twin-seat TF-104G versions, redesignated as the CF-104D and equipped with the J79 OEL-7 engine, were built by Lockheed with Canadian avionics modifications and reused for initial CF-104 training. The CF-104 was long and slender, with short, sharp wings and a T-tail. It was 16.7 meters long, 4.08 meters tall, and had a wingspan of only 6.63 meters. The thin wings were 11 centimeters thick at the root and 5 centimeters thick at the tip. The sharp wings posed a hazard to ground crews, and protective covers were installed during maintenance. The CF-104 could fly at altitudes in excess of 15,240 meters, and speeds of more than 2,695 kilometers per hour, or Mach 2.2. Interestingly, the limiting factor for its top speed was the compressor intake air temperature. Any faster and the ensuing heated air would overtemp the engine. This tremendous performance was thanks to the mighty Orenda J79 OEL-7 afterburning turbojet engine, producing 44.5 kilonewtons of thrust at sea level. This was increased to 70 kilonewtons with the afterburners lit. It had a combat range of 675 kilometers with 2 tip tanks, or could fly 2,630 kilometers in a ferrying configuration. The landing gear would not fit into the thin wings, so they retract into the slender fuselage. This complex folding mechanism delayed the early American production aircraft, but the problems were fixed by the time Canadair began production. Landing speeds of the CF-104 are around 300 kilometers per hour. Large hydraulic brakes and a drag chute slow the aircraft down. An arrestor hook is present for emergency situations when the aircraft's drag chute or hydraulics fail. A cable strung across the road at the departure ends of the runway would be caught by the hook, bringing the CF-104 to a quick stop. The cockpit was austere from a modern perspective. All the instruments and avionics were analog. Pilots had to navigate and fly with hydraulically boosted flight controls and an autopilot that was coupled to the inertial navigation system. It was ahead of its time for both controls and avionics, but still used vacuum tubes in the avionics boxes. Their bulk occupied a significant portion of the airframe and overall weight. The CF-104 would be the last of the Century Series fighters for Canada. Its replacement, the CF-18, would propel pilots well into the digital age. The CF-104 was equipped with a Lockheed C2 ejection seat. Boot spurs are located on the boot heels and attached to the C2 with thin cables. In the event of an ejection, these spurs would pull the legs tight to the seat, while a net would simultaneously close around the pilot's arms to prevent flailing injuries during high-speed ejections. The CF-104 accommodated 4 external stations for additional fuel tanks. Tip tanks are standard on each wing, and under each wing, an additional fuel tank could be suspended on an underwing pylon. Several hardpoints are also under each wing, and in later years these would be used for various air-to-ground conventional weapons. The centerline hardpoints carried thermonuclear weapons, the reconnaissance camera pod, a practice bomb dispenser, or other ordnance as determined later in the program. The CF-104 initially carried no defensive weapons or systems due to its anticipated low-level attack profile. It was thought that speed, low altitude, and the small size of the 104 could keep it safe from enemy aircraft systems and interceptors. The offensive weapon configuration evolved through time. Initially, the CF-104 had two distinct configurations, either equipped with 4 Vinton Vicon 70mm cameras located in a centerline mounted pod for the reconnaissance role, or for the nuclear strike role, it could be armed with US supplied nuclear weapons. A single 70 kiloton Mark 28, 1 megaton B-43, or 20 kiloton B-57 parachute retarded free-fall thermonuclear bomb could be carried on a centerline pylon. The nuclear strike role was unique within the RCAF. The missions were flown by single 104s. Because of its 675 kilometer combat range, these squadrons could easily cover all of East and West Germany, northern Italy, and southern Denmark. In an all-out war, the target area was Central Europe, which included East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and possibly Western Poland. These missions were hoped to return home, or at least to west of the Iron Curtain. Failing that, it was projected that the CF-104s make it to a bailout location where they could safely parachute to the ground and remain in hiding for the remainder of the war. It was expected to last a few days at most, unless there was total nuclear annihilation. Thankfully, this near-suicidal mission, although trained for, was never carried out. In 1961, the Canadian CF-104s commenced their long service with the RCAF after the first aircraft was delivered to 6th Strike Reconnaissance Operational Training Unit in Cold Lake, Alberta. The all-weather OTU was relocated there from RCAF station Bagotville, Quebec, to train CF-104 pilots destined for Europe in the strike and reconnaissance role. Combat-ready training for the reconnaissance role was conducted at the operational bases. Later, all pilots were trained in the low-level conventional ground attack role. Canadair was hoping to market a specialized version of the Tudor trainer equipped with NASAR systems. Unfortunately, they couldn't find any customers and the project was cancelled. NASAR radar training was instead carried out using 3 modified Dakota transports, sporting a Starfighter nose cone and a radar set with multiple displays. The CF-104 Starfighters destined for Europe would form the RCAF's nuclear strike force. 139 were partially disassembled and flown across the ocean in C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. They initially formed 8 squadrons. The first to form was 427 Squadron at 3 Wing, located in Zweibrücken, Germany, in December of 1962. In April of the following year, they were joined by 434 Squadron. By July of 1963, 422 and 444 squadrons were formed at 4 Wing in Baden-Solingen, Germany. In late 1963, 421 and 430 squadrons were deployed to 2 Wing at Cretonquin, France. Shortly after their deployment, the French government decided to pursue their own nuclear weapons program and did not want foreign powers to store their weapons on French soil. As a result, 2 Wing was disbanded, and the 421 and 430 nuclear strike squadrons were moved to bases in Germany. By February 1964, 421 was moved to 4 Wing in Baden-Solingen, and 430 was moved to 3 Wing in Zweibrücken. By March 1964, 439 and 441 photo reconnaissance squadrons were formed at 1 Wing in Marville, France, remaining there until 1967 when they were moved to Lahr, West Germany. 434 and 444 squadrons based in Germany were disbanded in 1968, thus reducing the CF-104 strength in Europe to 4 nuclear strike squadrons and 2 reconnaissance squadrons. In May of 1969, 3 Wing, based in Zweibrücken, was closed, and the 427 was moved to 4 Wing in Baden-Solingen. 430 was moved to one wing in Lahr, retaining its strike role to join the 439 and 441 squadrons. In 1968, the budget-conscious Canadian government made the controversial decision to integrate all three military services and rebrand the RCAF as the Canadian Armed Forces. The strength of one air division was reduced from 6 squadrons to 3 and renamed one Canadian Air Group. In 1970, a decision was made to concentrate Army units in Lahr, and the CF-104s would be concentrated at Baden. As a result, 422, 427, and 430 squadrons were disbanded. 439 and 441 squadrons were moved to 4-wing at CFB Baden-Solingen to join the 421. Starting in 1970, 421 and 441 squadrons were converted to the conventional ground attack role, while the 439 squadron remained in the reconnaissance role. By 1972, all squadrons had converted to conventional ground attack. This decision changed the role of the CF-104s from nuclear strike to conventional ground attack, and necessitated further modifications. The 104s were re-equipped with the M61A1 cannon, and new pylons were installed on the wing hardpoints for the carriage of conventional munitions. Weapons carried by the modified CF-104s include Mark 82 Snake Eye iron bombs, napalm canisters, Mark 20 Rockeye and BL-755 cluster bombs, and Canadian-designed CVR-7 rocket pods. The radar was adapted from an air-to-ground mode to a more multi-mission capability that included air-to-air modes. Capable of aerial combat, the CF-104s never carried any air-to-air ordnance other than the Vulcan cannon. By 1972, all CF-104s had been modified to the new standard, which would remain until they were withdrawn from service. In contrast to the solo nuclear strike mission, the conventional attack role involved multiple aircraft. Each aircraft could carry only 4 bombs, and so as many as 12 CF-104s would be involved in a single attack to ensure destruction of the target. Coordinating these attacks was challenging, and added a further layer of complexity to the pilot workload. NATO required pilots be able to deliver weapons on target plus or minus 3 seconds from their assigned time. They flew in 4-plane sections and separated their attacks by 30 seconds to prevent striking fragmentation from the preceding weapons detonating on the target. Between 1972 and 1974, and following the conversion to the F-104G standard, Canada sold 22 CF-104s to Norway, plus 15 CF-104s and 7 CF-104Ds to Denmark. These sales reflected the reduction in squadrons fielded by the Canadian Armed Forces in Europe. Starting in 1981, Canada began to phase out the CF-104s. 46 CF-104s and 6 CF-104Ds were transferred to the Turkish Air Force to join 3 CF-104s previously transferred there by Norway. Prior to delivery, 20 were overhauled in Germany, and the remainder were stripped as spares. The CF-104s remained in Turkish service until they were retired in 1996, and were replaced by the F-16. The 6th Strike and Reconnaissance OTU in Cold Lake, Alberta was redesignated as the 417 Squadron in 1970, when the RCAF was reformed as the Canadian Armed Forces. The last class to graduate was in November 1982, and the squadron was disbanded in 1983. Their planes were flown to CFB Baden-Solingen in the officially named Operation Starleap, but pilots and crews affectionately called it the Hog Hawk. By 1985, all CF-104s in the Canadian inventory were retired and replaced by the CF-18 Hornet. There were many unofficial names for the CF-104, including Starfighter, Silver Sliver, Zipper, Pig, Aluminum Death Tube, the Lawn Dart, and the Flying Phallus. However, ground crews and pilots mainly referred to it as the 104. It should be noted that pilots and technicians never referred to the aircraft as the Widowmaker. That was considered disrespectful to the wives and families of fallen pilots. That term was instead used by the media to sensationalize the CF-104's accident record. 43% of Canadian CF-104s crashed. The nature of their mission, pilot workload, environmental conditions, and bird strikes all played a role. Pilots flew at high speeds near treetop levels to attack their targets. The 104 had a steep glide ratio due to its small, heavily loaded wings, and this combined with the low-level missions meant that when accidents did occur, there was little time to correct or eject before hitting the ground. Despite this, 104 pilots flew thousands of missions to test and hone their skills. Workloads in the 104 were high and sometimes led to accidents. For example, to drop a set of cluster bombs, 11 switches were set while navigating with a stopwatch and map at treetop levels and high speeds. Any mistakes could result in a collision with the trees or ground. In later years, this became known as controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. Bird strikes were a big problem, as the 500-foot normal operating altitude meant that the aircraft was flying at the same altitude as birds. Ingesting them into the engine intake was a problem that resulted in major or fatal damage to the engine. Smog and pollution was also a huge problem. In the 1960s and 70s, Europeans depended on coal to heat their homes and power their industry. As a result, the air quality was extremely poor, and this dramatically reduced the pilot's visibility. A visibility of 3 kilometers, traveling at speeds near Mach 1, resulted in pilots having only seconds to react. Approximately 20% of 104 crashes were the result of mechanical failures, including failures with the afterburner and oil and fuel pumps. Some were pilot-induced mechanical failures, but only 3 can be directly attributed to maintenance-related mistakes, a tribute to the fine work done by the technicians. From a flight hour perspective, Canada had one of the lowest accident rates among all countries that flew the 104 in Europe. 115 airframes, or 43% of Canadian CF-104s crashed, killing 37 pilots. This compares to the German loss rate of 292 airframes, or 32% of their inventory, killing 115 pilots. One difference between the two was that Canadian CF-104s flew an average of 6,000 hours before retiring the airframes, while the Germans flew an average of only 2,000 hours before retiring theirs. This is to say that Canadian pilots flew 3 times more missions than the Germans per aircraft. While the loss rate is still extremely high, it does put into perspective the skill of the Canadian pilots in executing dangerous missions. The Canadian-built CF-104 was the fastest aircraft ever to serve with the Canadian Armed Forces, and was well respected by its pilots. It leaves a fine legacy that continues to inspire aviation enthusiasts to this day.